Welcome to the channel, everyone. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you for listening. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows of the small cabin nestled deep in the Wyoming wilderness. Gray clouds hung low, promising more snow before the day was over. Bean sat near the crackling fire, his boots propped up on the stone hearth. A mug of coffee warming his hands. His dog Shadow, a black Labrador with a white streak on his chest, lay curled up on a worn rug, ears twitching as the wind picked up. Bean had come here to clear his head, away from the clamor of San Francisco. The city felt suffocating these days, the noise, the endless buzz of people. Out here, the only sounds were the wind and the occasional creak of trees. He had spent years as a soldier, and though he'd traded his rifle for the comfort of painting miniature Warhammer 40k figures, he still felt the itch to escape, to find solace in isolation. The cabin belonged to a buddy from his unit, who had warned him the winters here could be brutal. Bean thought it was perfect, a week in the middle of nowhere, just him, Shadow, and the snow-covered forest. The first couple of days had been uneventful. He'd split wood for the fire, taken Shadow for short walks in the crisp air, and even started painting a new set of miniatures he'd brought with him. The tranquility was exactly what he needed. But on the third night, the peace shattered. It started with a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like footsteps crunching through the snow. Shadow's ears perked up immediately, and he lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Bean asked, setting his mug down. He stood and grabbed the flashlight hanging by the door. Shadow was already at the window, his nose pressed the glass, his growl growing louder. Bean flicked on the flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the frigid night. The beam of light swept across the snow-covered yard, illuminating the trees that stood like silent sentinels around the cabin. Nothing. The wind moaned through the forest, and for a moment Bean wondered if Shadow had just heard the trees creaking. He turned to go back inside when he saw it, a shape barely visible, standing behind one of the trees. Bean froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure was tall, impossibly so, with broad shoulders and a dark silhouette that blended into the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Bean could feel its eyes on him, watching. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Who's there?" The figure stepped back, disappearing behind the tree. Bean's heart pounded as he retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind him. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded, and sat by the fire, the weapon within arm's reach. Shadow stayed by his side, his growl never ceasing. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Bean tried to convince himself it was just a hiker, maybe a poacher, someone who'd gotten too close to the cabin, but deep down he knew better. The next morning he found tracks in the snow, massive footprints that led from the tree line to the edge of the yard and back. The following night was worse. The sound of footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Shadow barked furiously, his hackles raised, but Bean couldn't bring himself to open the door again. The creature began tapping on the windows, a rhythmic knock that sent chills down Bean's spine. When he shined the flashlight toward the sound, he caught a glimpse of a massive, hairy hand retreating into the shadows. By dawn, Bean knew he couldn't stay. He packed his gear, leashed Shadow, and started the long trek back to his truck. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of snow under his boots. He kept his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the trees. Shadow barked suddenly, jerking on the leash. Bean turned just in time to see the creature step into view. It was enormous, covered in dark, matted fur, its face a horrifying mix of human and ape. Its eyes glinted with intelligence as it stared at him, unblinking. Bean raised his rifle, but the creature didn't move. It stood there, watching, as if daring him to fire. "Let's go," Bean whispered, pulling Shadow along. The creature followed, keeping its distance, but never letting them out of its sight. As they neared the truck, it let out a guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the trees. Shadow barked, straining against the leash, but Bean didn't stop. He threw his gear into the truck bed and climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. The creature watched from the edge of the woods as he started the engine and sped down the icy road. Back in town, Bean recounted the events to the local ranger, who listened with a skeptical smile. "You're not the first to see something like that," the ranger said. "Folks around here call it Bigfoot. You'd best stay out of the woods if you value your sanity." Bean didn't argue. He knew what he'd seen, and he had no intention of ever going back. The Appalachians were a dream in the summer, their emerald peaks stretching endlessly under the vast blue sky. James Cavill adjusted his pack and scanned the tree line ahead. He felt alive out here, away from the humid Miami air and the digital chaos of his job as an IT specialist. Hiking had become his solace over the years, a reprieve from troubleshooting servers and endless Zoom calls. He wasn't alone on this trek. The group consisted of 7 strangers, brought together by a travel agency promising an unforgettable day hike. They were a diverse mix. Carla, an energetic woman in her late 30s who loved to talk. Sam, a quiet teenager glued to his sketchpad. Beth and Mark, a middle-aged couple who'd taken up hiking to bond after Mark's retirement. And 2 college buddies, Alex and Daniel, who seemed to treat the trip as a workout challenge. As they ascended the narrow trail, the canopy of trees above offered sporadic relief from the heat. The guide, a burly man named Roger, kept them moving at a steady pace, his machete occasionally clearing a stray branch. "Storm's coming in later," Roger said, pointing at the darkening horizon. "We'll camp out if it gets bad. Shouldn't last more than a couple of hours." James nodded, though the idea of spending the night in the woods unsettled him. The Appalachians were beautiful, but their isolation was palpable. The day went smoothly. They reached a ridge overlooking a valley dotted with dense forest. Lunch was a quiet affair, punctuated by the occasional joke or question about the wildlife. Carla swore she saw a bear, but Roger dismissed it as a shadow. By mid-afternoon, the weather shifted. Thick gray clouds rolled in, and the air grew heavy. The group decided to set up camp near a stream. Roger instructed everyone to gather wood for a fire while he pitched the tents. As the first drops of rain fell, James helped Carla and Alex with the fire. The flames flickered to life just as the drizzle turned into a downpour. The group huddled close, the firelight casting eerie shadows on their faces. The conversation drifted to campfire tales, and someone mentioned cryptids. "Ever heard about Bigfoot?" Carla asked, her voice playful but tinged with curiosity. "Just a myth," Mark said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Roger leaned back, his face serious. "You hear things out here, strange things, but most folks chalk it up to the wind or animals." James chuckled nervously, recalling similar stories he'd heard during other hikes, tales of enormous footprints, guttural howls, and eyes glinting in the darkness. He told himself it was nonsense, but something about the Appalachians felt different. The storm eased around midnight, leaving the forest soaked and silent. The fire burned low, and one by one the group retired to their tents. James was about to turn in when Shadow barked, a sharp guttural noise that echoed through the trees. "What's wrong, boy?" he murmured, though he realized the dog wasn't there. remembering only in the moment of slipping into reflex. A sound broke the stillness, a branch snapping. James grabbed his flashlight and scanned the tree line. The beam illuminated rain-soaked trunks and dripping leaves. Then just beyond the firelight, he saw it. A figure crouched behind the tree, massive and still. "Roger," James hissed, his voice barely audible. The guide emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" James pointed. The figure shifted, retreating further into the shadows. Roger's face darkened. He grabbed his machete and motioned for the group to stay quiet. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As Roger approached the tree, the figure disappeared into the woods, its movements unnervingly fast for something so large. "What the hell was that?" Carla whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," James said, his heart pounding. The group huddled closer to the fire, their earlier camaraderie replaced by fear. They decided to leave at first light, but none of them could sleep. As dawn broke, they packed quickly, the forest around them eerily quiet. The trail back to the cars felt longer, the dense foliage closing in on them. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and close. The creature emerged from the shadows, standing at least 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in matted fur, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent intelligence. "Run!" Roger shouted, swinging his machete as the group scattered. James ran blindly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear screams behind him, the sound of metal striking flesh. He tripped, falling hard on the wet ground. When he looked up, the creature was gone, but its growl echoed in his ears. Somehow the group reunited near the trailhead. Roger was missing, and Daniel clutched his arm, blood streaming from a deep gash. They piled into their cars and sped away, leaving the forest behind. Later, James would learn about the legends surrounding the area, stories of a creature that watched, waited, and hunted. He didn't need convincing, he knew it was real. The air in northern Michigan was thick with the scent of pine and fresh grass, a far cry from the dry heat of Los Angeles that Chuck Russell was used to. He adjusted his glasses, feeling the weight of the summer humidity as he stepped onto the porch of the rental house. The house was a two-story, colonial, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. It was old, creaking, with the stories of decades gone by. Chuck wasn't alone. His friends, who he knew from college, had convinced him to take a few days off for a summer getaway. There was Mike, the laid-back artist, Laura, a sharp and witty journalist, and Jason, the physical trainer who always brought an unsettling amount of protein bars. They planned to relax, grill out, and maybe explore the nearby woods if they felt adventurous. The first evening passed quietly. They grilled steaks and played cards, the warm summer night punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Chuck found himself staring at the edge of the forest more than he'd like. He shook it off as nerves. He wasn't used to this kind of quiet. "I'm telling you, this place has stories," Laura said, sipping her beer. "Stories?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. Laura grinned. "This area has been famous for cryptid sightings. Bigfoot, Dogman, you name it. Locals swear they've seen things." "That's just people with overactive imaginations," Jason said, though he glanced at the dark tree line. Chuck laughed uneasily, remembering campfire tales from past hikes. He loved horror games and movies, but this felt different. As the night deepened, the group retreated to their rooms. The house creaked and groaned, a symphony of unsettling noises that Chuck chalked up to its age. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then came the first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic tapping on the living room window. Chuck sat up, his heart pounding. The others heard it too. Doors opened, footsteps echoed down the hall. What the hell was that? Laura whispered, clutching a flashlight. Mike shrugged, trying to mask his unease. Probably a branch in the wind. There's no wind, Chuck said. Jason, armed with a baseball bat, led the group downstairs. They scanned the living room, finding nothing amiss, but the tapping had stopped. Chuck felt the hairs on the back of his head rise. He stepped closer to the window, peering into the darkness. Just beyond the reach of the porch light, something shifted. A shadow, too large to be human, slid behind the tree. "Did you see that?" Chuck asked, his voice barely audible. "See what?" Jason asked. Chuck hesitated. "I don't know. Something." They locked the doors and tried to brush it off, but sleep was elusive. The house felt different now, colder, more oppressive. The next day was uneventful, though attention hung in the air. They stayed close to the house, grilling lunch and pretending everything was fine. By evening, storm clouds rolled in, darkening the sky and cloaking the woods in an ominous shadow. That night, the knocking returned, louder this time. The windows rattled, and the group huddled in the living room, weapons in hand. Then a sound from upstairs, a heavy thud, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. "Is someone in the house?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. Jason nodded grimly. "Stay here." He crept upstairs, the baseball bat gripped tightly. The group waited in tense silence. Then Jason's scream echoed through the house, followed by a crash. They bolted upstairs, finding Jason sprawled on the floor, his face pale. "What happened?" Mike asked, helping him up. "I saw it," Jason stammered. "It's huge. It was standing in the hallway, watching me." "What was it?" Chuck demanded. "I don't know," Jason said, his voice cracking. "It's not human." They barricaded themselves in the living room, the storm raging outside. The creature didn't knock this time. It pounded on the walls, circled the house, and occasionally paused to scrape its claws along the windows. Through the storm's fury, Chuck caught glimpses of it. A hulking silhouette darting between trees, always just out of reach of the light. "We can't stay here," Laura said. "How do we leave?" Mike asked. "There's a back door," Chuck said. "We make a run for the car." Gathering their courage, they moved silently through the house. The creature seemed to toy with them, its heavy footsteps echoing just beyond the walls. At the back door, they made a break for it, sprinting through the rain-soaked yard. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees. As they reached the car, the creature lunged from the darkness. It was massive, its eyes glowing like embers. Jason swung his bat, connecting with a sickening crunch, but it barely slowed the thing down. Chuck fumbled with the keys, the adrenaline making his hands shake. Finally, the engine roared to life, and they sped away, the creature's roar fading into the distance. They didn't stop until they reached a gas station miles away. "What the hell was that thing?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper. No one had an answer. Back in Los Angeles, Chuck couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes. He'd heard stories of the dogman before, but he never believed them. Now he wasn't so sure. Blue mountains stretched endlessly before us, their rolling peaks shrouded in a soft green haze. Spring had coaxed wildflowers to bloom along the trails, and the rivers surged with snow melt. This was supposed to be a break, a chance for us to unwind, cast a few lines, and forget about the grind of daily life. I, Arthur Oldman, wasn't much of a fisherman, but I loved the idea of escape. Back home in rural Indiana, I spent most of my days in the garage, elbows deep in grease and engines. Gym training was my outlet, my way of shaking off the weight of everything else. My friends convinced me that this trip would be good for me, a chance to unplug. There was Mitch, the planner of our group, whose camping skills we relied on entirely. Tommy, always cracking jokes and lightening the mood, and Alex, the quiet one, who had an uncanny knack for spotting fish. My dog, Duke, a scrappy loyal mutt with ears too big for his head, trotted along beside me. The campsite was nestled in a clearing near a wide, serene river. It was calm, the kind of quiet that made you aware of every sound: the rustling leaves, the faint hum of insects, and the distant call of a bird. We set up tents, built a fire, and settled in for the first night. As the sun dipped below the peaks, we shared stories around the fire, our laughter carrying into the night. Mitch warned us about bears, going over the do's and don'ts. Tommy made bear noises to spook him. "That's not funny," Mitch said, dead serious. "These woods have history. People have talked about strange things around here." "Strange things?" I asked. He hesitated. "You know, stories. Bigfoot sightings, things like that." Tommy laughed. "You mean people getting drunk and seeing shadows?" Alex chimed in quietly. "Some say the shadows follow you." The fire cracked, and for a moment none of us spoke. I tried to shake it off, but the thought stuck with me as I laid in my tent later that night. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. We fished, laughed, and explored. Duke barked at every squirrel and chased sticks with unrelenting energy. By the second night, the forest felt less like a threat and more like an old friend. It was the third night when things changed. We were gathered around the fire, the air heavy with the scent of charred wood and cooking trout. The conversation had turned lazy, comfortable. Then from the woods came a noise. A deep, guttural howl rolled through the trees, silencing us instantly. It wasn't a wolf, nor anything I can place. "What the hell was that?" Tommy asked, his voice low. Mitch stood, his face pale. "Probably a bear." "No bear makes that sound," Alex whispered. Duke growled, the fur on his back standing on end. He bolted toward the tree line before I could grab him. "Duke, come back," I called, but he disappeared into the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and a knife, and the others followed. We moved cautiously, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the night. Then, another sound, closer this time, a low guttural rumble, almost like breathing. "Turn off the light," Mitch whispered. Reluctantly, I clicked it off. The darkness enveloped us, and for a moment, we just listened. There was movement ahead. A shadow shifted, impossibly large, ducking behind a tree. I caught the faint gleam of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Too high to belong to any animal I knew. "It's watching us," Alex murmured. Duke barked, somewhere deeper in the woods. The shadow moved again, closer this time. "Run!" Mitch hissed. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, our breaths ragged. I called for Duke, but my voice was drowned out by the pounding in my ears. The thing was following us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. We burst back into the clearing, gasping for air. Mitch grabbed the camp hatchet and Alex clutched the fishing spear. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the trees. Then it appeared. It stood just beyond the firelight, massive and hunched. Its eyes burned like embers and its form was obscured by shadow, as if the darkness clung to it. It made a sound, a low guttural growl, that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Mitch swung the hatchet as it lunged, but the thing moved with inhuman speed, knocking him aside like a rag doll. Blood splattered the ground, and Mitch didn't get back up. Duke appeared, snarling and snapping at the creature's heels. It swatted at him, missing by inches. "Get to the car," I shouted, grabbing Alex and Tommy. We ran, leaving the fire and Mitch behind. My heart ached, but survival took over. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at us as we sprinted. The creature's howls echoed behind us, closer and closer. We reached the car, fumbling with the keys as the thing emerged from the woods. Its massive form loomed over us, and for a moment I thought we were done for. Then Duke charged it, barking wildly. The distraction gave us just enough time to pile into the car and speed away. As the creature faded into the distance, I realized Duke wasn't with us. My chest tightened, but I knew going back wasn't an option. We drove in silence, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. Back in town, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, nor the guilt of leaving Mitch and Duke behind. Stories of the Yowie, a cryptid said to haunt these mountains, had always seemed like tall tales, but now I wasn't so sure. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good night.